On the morning of March 10, 2019, Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 lifted off from Addis Ababa. 157 people on board. Families, students, aid workers heading to a UN conference in Nairobi. 6 minutes later, it was gone. No turbulence, no storm, no engine fire. The plane, a brand new Boeing 737 MAX 8, just pitched its nose down and kept going. The pilots fought it. The flight data recorder shows them pulling back on the controls with everything they had. It didn't matter. What made this crash different from almost any other aviation disaster in modern history wasn't just the scale of the tragedy. It was what investigators found when they started pulling at the threads. This wasn't a freak accident. It wasn't a 1 in a million mechanical failure. Because just 5 months earlier, a nearly identical Boeing 737 MAX Lion Air Flight 610 had gone down in the Java Sea. 189 people dead. Same aircraft, same pattern, same terrifying sequence of events. 2 crashes, 346 people total, and the same software system sitting at the center of the booth. When the world learned what Boeing had known, what they'd hidden, downplayed, and quietly buried in footnotes of technical manuals, the reaction wasn't just grief. It was something colder. A slow, dawning realization that one of the most trusted engineering companies in American history had made a decision. A deliberate, calculated boardroom decision. And 346 people paid for it with their lives. This is the story of how Boeing, a company that once defined what American manufacturing could be, traded its engineering soul for a stock price, and the CEO who let it happen. What was the problem? To understand what Boeing did, you first have to understand what Boeing was afraid of. It's 2011. Boeing is the largest aerospace company in the world. For decades, they dominated commercial aviation alongside their only real rival, Airbus. The two had settled into an uneasy duopoly. Boeing had the 737, Airbus had the A320, both narrow-body workhorses, the kind of plane that flies you from Chicago to Dallas, the backbone of every major airline's fleet. Then, Airbus made a move. In December 2010, they announced the A320neo, a re-engined version of their existing jet fitted with new fuel-efficient engines. 15% better fuel efficiency than the previous generation. For airlines burning millions of gallons of fuel every year, that's not a minor upgrade. That's a financial transformation. Boeing's response? Nothing. At first, their internal position was that the future was a clean sheet aircraft, a brand new plane built from scratch, designed around next-generation technology. That was the Boeing way. Engineering first. Take your time. Get it right. The same culture that built the 747, the 777, the 787 Dreamliner. But then, American Airlines made a phone call that changed everything. In the summer of 2011, American Airlines, one of Boeing's most loyal customers, told Boeing they were seriously considering a massive order for the A320neo. We're talking potentially 460 aircraft. They wanted fuel efficiency. They wanted it now. And if Boeing couldn't deliver something comparable, Airbus was getting the contract. Boeing had a choice. Tell American to wait 2 or 3 years while they developed a proper next-generation aircraft, or re-engine the existing 737, just like Airbus had done, and get something to market faster. Problem was, the 737 had a dirty little secret. A design constraint buried in the aircraft's history going all the way back to 1967. The original 737 sat so low to the ground that its engines had to be mounted forward and slightly above the wing. A compromise because the plane was designed for airports where ground clearance was tight. That quirk had been carried forward through every generation of 737, and now it was a serious problem. The fuel-efficient engines that made the A320neo so competitive were significantly larger in diameter than the old ones. On the Airbus airframe, there was room. On the 737, the geometry simply didn't work. The engines wouldn't fit where they were supposed to. Boeing's engineers knew this. They flagged it, they ran the numbers, and Boeing's executives made the call anyway. they would re-engine the 737, mount the new engines higher and further forward on the wing, a repositioning that would change how the aircraft handled in the air. They'd call it the 737 MAX, fast-track the certification process, and keep costs down by convincing regulators the MAX was similar enough to existing 737s that pilots wouldn't need full simulator training, just an iPad course, a few hours of computer-based learning. They won the American Airlines contract. Then, the orders started pouring in from airlines worldwide. By 2017, Boeing had 4,600 orders for the 737 MAX, the fastest-selling aircraft in the company's history. The bet had worked, or so it seemed. Here's where you have to understand the man at the center of this story. Dennis Muilenburg became CEO of Boeing in July 2015. By every traditional measure, he looked like the perfect fit. He spent his entire career at the company, joined straight out of Iowa State in 1985, worked his way up through defense programs, ran major divisions, became COO, then the top job. 30 years inside Boeing, he knew the planes, he knew the culture. He was an engineer by training. But by the time Muilenburg took the chair, Boeing wasn't really being run like an engineering company anymore. That transformation had started years earlier, quietly, gradually, and it had everything to do with a merger. In 1997, Boeing acquired McDonnell Douglas, its struggling American competitor. On paper, Boeing absorbed McDonnell Douglas. In reality, something closer to the opposite happened. The McDonnell Douglas executive culture, shareholder first, cost-cutting, finance-driven, absorbed Boeing. Their executives moved into senior leadership positions at the combined company, and the old Boeing ethos, the one where engineers had the final word and safety was non-negotiable regardless of cost, began to erode. By the time Muilenburg became CEO, stock performance was the metric that mattered most, and he leaned into it. Under his leadership, Boeing committed to an aggressive stock buyback program, spending $43 billion buying back its own shares between 2013 and 2019. That's not investment in new technology. That's not R&D. That's money going directly to shareholders. It boosted the stock price beautifully. Wall Street loved it. Meanwhile, the 737 MAX program was moving fast. Too fast. Those repositioned engines, sitting higher and further forward on the wing, created a real aerodynamic issue. In certain flight conditions, at high angles of attack, the new engine placement caused the nose to pitch upward more aggressively than previous 737 variants. Left unchecked, that could lead to an aerodynamic stall. Boeing's solution was software. They called it MCAS, the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System. It was designed to automatically push the nose down if sensors detected the aircraft pitching up too steeply. Essentially, a software patch to make the MAX handle like the older 737s that pilots were already certified to fly. If MCAS worked, pilots wouldn't even need to know it existed. The plane would feel familiar. The iPad training would be enough. Airlines would be happy. The FAA wouldn't require expensive simulator recertification. And here's where the reasoning, flawed as it was, had a certain internal logic to it. Some airline contracts included clauses where Boeing would owe financial penalties if the MAX required full simulator training, because simulator training meant added cost for airlines. In at least one case, that penalty was reported $1 million per aircraft. With thousands of orders on the books, the financial exposure was staggering. So MCAS became more than just an engineering solution. It became a financial necessity. What Boeing did not tell pilots, and what they actively obscured in communications with the FAA, was how aggressive MCAS actually was. In its final certified form, MCAS could activate based on input from a single angle of attack sensor. Just one, no redundancy, and when it activated, it could move the nose down with a force that could overwhelm a pilot's ability to manually counteract it. It could activate repeatedly, in rapid cycles, pushing the nose further down each time. Boeing's own internal risk assessment had initially flagged MCAS as a hazardous system, one that required more rigorous safety review. That classification was later quietly downgraded. The FAA, which had been delegating more and more of its certification review work back to Boeing's own employees, largely took Boeing at their word. the 737 MAX entered commercial service in 2017. 14 months later, Lion Air 610 fell into the Java Sea. After Lion Air, Boeing did something that would later define the entire scandal. They did not ground the aircraft. They issued a bulletin reminding pilots of existing procedures for dealing with runaway stabilizer trim. They did not mention MCAS by name. They did not explain to airlines or pilots what the system actually did. They told the FAA the plane was safe to fly, and they kept delivering new MAX aircraft to customers around the world. 5 months later, Ethiopian Airlines 302 went down in almost identical circumstances. This time, the world didn't wait for Boeing's response. Country after country began grounding the 737 MAX on their own. China went first, then Europe, then Canada. The FAA, under enormous public and political pressure, finally grounded the entire MAX fleet on March 13, 2019, 3 days after the Ethiopian crash. The investigation that followed was devastating. Internal Boeing documents emerged. Messages between engineers and employees that painted a damning picture. One engineer had written back in 2016 that MCAS was running rampant in the simulator. Another message referred to the plane as designed by clowns, who are in turn supervised by monkeys. These weren't critics from the outside. These were Boeing employees, people building the plane. Congressional hearings followed. Muilenburg testified. He apologized. He said Boeing had made mistakes. He said the system worked but needed improvement. He deflected, qualified, and spoke in the careful language of corporate liability management. He also, during this period, collected tens of millions of dollars in compensation. In October 2019, as Boeing stock continued to fall and the pressure from airlines, regulators, and the families of the 346 victims mounted, Muilenburg was removed as CEO. Boeing's board announced his departure in December of that year. He left with a severance package worth approximately $62 million. In January 2021, Boeing entered into a deferred prosecution agreement with the U.S. Department of Justice. They agreed to pay $2.5 billion, a combination of fines, compensation to airline customers, and a fund for the victims' families. As part of the deal, Boeing would avoid criminal prosecution, providing they met certain conditions. The families of the 346 people who died called it a slap on the wrist. Many of them were right. $2.5 billion sounds like a large number until you realize Boeing had generated over $100 billion in revenue in 2018 alone. The fine represented, roughly, about 9 days of revenue. No individual Boeing executive was criminally charged in connection with the crashes. The 737 MAX was eventually recertified by the FAA in November 2020 and returned to commercial service with updated MCAS software, with new pilot training requirements, with sensor redundancy that should have been there from the beginning. The plane flies today, and by most accounts, the fixes are genuine. The updated system is safer, but the fact that those fixes were available, that the engineering solutions were knowable, makes the original decisions even harder to justify. Because this was never really a story about software or sensor redundancy or aerodynamics. It's a story about what happens when the people responsible for making life and death engineering decisions stop being answerable to engineers and start being answerable to shareholders. Boeing was once the kind of company where an engineer could halt a program if they had a serious safety concern, where the culture enforced, structurally and socially, that safety was above the bottom line. That culture didn't disappear overnight. It eroded incrementally. Through a merger, through financial incentive structures, through decades of small decisions that each seemed reasonable in isolation and catastrophic in aggregate. Muilenburg didn't invent that culture, but he inherited it, embraced it, and accelerated it. Under his watch, the pressure to protect the MAX program, to protect the stock price, to protect the no simulator required promise to airlines, overrode the warnings that were there to be heard, if anyone had been listening. 346 people boarded those two planes expecting to arrive at their destinations. They were flying on an aircraft whose fundamental safety flaw had been known, documented, flagged, and managed around rather than fixed. That's not a tragedy in the traditional sense of the word. A tragedy implies forces beyond our control. This was a choice. Boeing has been through significant changes since 2019. New leadership, new oversight, new commitments to safety culture, and recent years have brought fresh scrutiny, quality control issues, whistleblower accounts, incidents involving MAX and other aircraft that have kept Boeing under the regulatory microscope. Whether the company has genuinely changed at the level of culture, not just process, is a question that only time will answer. But the story of the 737 MAX isn't really about Boeing alone. It's a warning about what happens inside any institution, any company, any government agency, any organization, when the metrics of success get disconnected from the actual purpose of the work. Boeing's purpose was to build aircraft that were safe to fly. That was the thing, the whole thing, and for a long time, they were extraordinarily good at it. Then, gradually, the purpose became secondary to the metric, and the metric was the stock price. 346 people died because of that shift. Their names are documented. Their families are still fighting for accountability. And the story of what Boeing knew and when, and what they chose to do about it, is one of the most important corporate accountability cases of the 21st century. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. This one matters.